When the bells chimed for Easter in 1976, the Cathedral of Nicosia had a unique archbishop. He was church and state in one person. Archbishop Makarios was head of the Orthodox Church of Cyprus. But Archbishop Makarios was also President Makarios, the political leader of the Greek Cypriots. There are clear advantages for a politician in a religious country if he and God appear to be of the same party. It was 1600 years ago in Christian history that church and state first stood together. The partnership began with the founding of the first Christian empire by the Emperor Constantine. Constantine believed that Christ had helped him win Rome. The result, he turned the Roman Empire into the Christian Empire. The area over which Rome had established control was vast. You could march all round the Mediterranean without ever leaving Roman soil. But when Constantine turned this into a Christian empire, he also gave it a new capital city. We know it today as Istanbul. Its original name was Byzantium, but he called it after himself Constantinople. In this city, for the first time, Christianity was on show as the official religion of the state. The faith, which had begun in a tiny corner of the Roman Empire, was at the center of the stage. Christian symbols were used as part of imperial propaganda. And the natural place to look for them is beneath the domes of Santa Sofia, the great central cathedral of the empire. But today, it stands empty. After 11 centuries, the Byzantine emperors lost their city to the Turks. This church became a mosque. But one can discover elsewhere what once lined these walls. The secret symbols of the early Christians, presented in spectacular public display. Once it had been dangerous to believe. Now it was more dangerous not to believe. All those mosaics are from churches in the Italian town of Ravenna. This was an important place on the route between Rome and Constantinople. Emperors spent money on this city, and no less than 6 churches survive here, all of them built before the year 600. The Church of San Vitale expresses perfectly the new Christian empire and its propaganda. Here, in the glittering medium of mosaic, could be seen the political hierarchy. Above sits Christ, accompanied by his angels and saints. He sits now in majesty, holding the law, a stern figure, even though he still has the fresh, clean-shaven face of the Jesus of the early Christians. Below is the earthly court, the reflection of Christ's above. At its center is the Emperor Justinian. Like Christ, he has a halo. In fact, Roman emperors had been seen with halos long before they were Christians. From their point of view, it was Christ, not them, who was the new member of this club. To complete the earthly court, there is also the retinue of the Empress, Theodora. She'd had a lurid sex life before she reached this exalted position, living proof, perhaps, that Christianity welcomed sinners, at any rate when they married the emperor. The hard, jewel-like perfection of mosaic suggested a Christian empire that was not only wealthy, but stable. The implication was that nothing now could unsettle this emperor and his powerful court. Just as Jesus ruled eternally with his angels, so the emperor had his priests and his bishop, Maximian. But the position of Maximian in this courtly lineup makes it plain that the good bishop is a courtier, a yes man, someone who will accept the emperor's interpretation of Christ. And there were a few bishops who rejected this role. Ambrose was the most famous of them. He became Bishop of Milan 1,500 years ago. Today, St. Ambrose lies beneath a church named after him in Milan. And the pilgrims come down to hear about their city's most distinguished bishop, who had the courage to stand up to an emperor.
Ambrogio era il vescovo che aveva sede praticamente, sede vescovile in questa chiesa. Solo dopo la sua morte gli è stata dedicata la chiesa, capite? Infatti vedi San Gervasio e Protaso. Vedete di scorrere un momentino dietro, come ci hanno detto. Ecco, il motivo del rosone, se vogliamo, è ripreso lì. Sono i santi, avanti, se no non vedete tutto. E quello è vero, sono due santi, San Gervasio e San Protaso. Va bene?
One event from the life of Ambrose became famous as an example of how a bishop could tame a prince. In the year 390, there was a riot in a city in Greece, all because a popular charioteer had been thrown into prison. But during the riot, the governor of the city got killed. The emperor, Theodosius, was in Milan at the time, and he sent orders for a grisly punishment. Several thousand fans of the charioteer were invited into their local circus to see a special performance. When they were in, the gates were locked, and the emperor's soldiers started killing them. At least 5,000 died. When Ambrose heard the news, he told the emperor that he couldn't give him communion until he had done penance for his crime. Well, at first, Theodosius just avoided coming to church, but eventually he accepted Ambrose's terms, and in front of a crowded congregation, he took off his splendid imperial robes and publicly asked for pardon. But it seems quite natural to us that a priest should object if one of his parishioners kills 5,000 people. But it required remarkable courage to humiliate, in this way, a Byzantine emperor. Ambrose had hit upon a weapon, the threat of excommunication, which the Western Church would later use again and again to bring rulers to heel. The Western Church long ago separated from the Imperial Church of Constantinople. And, like Ambrose, Western bishops see themselves as independent of the state. Each year on St. Ambrose's Day, the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan visits the Church of St. Ambrose. Unlike Archbishop Makarios, this archbishop has no political position. But that will certainly not prevent him from giving advice to his flock come election time. Since the days of Ambrose, the bishops of the Western Roman Catholic Church have felt it their right, indeed their duty, to assert political pressure, whether against emperors, kings, or modern political parties. The Church in the West was to become a political power in its own right, and to have an independence never achieved by bishops under the Byzantine emperors. So it's not surprising that each year, the Archbishop of Milan preaches an impassioned sermon about the memory and example of Ambrose.
Del nostro più grande vescovo Ambrogio. Sono trascorsi 16 secoli, eppure sentiamo che Ambrogio è ancora tra noi, vivo ed eloquente.
Services in the Church of St. Ambrose today are Roman Catholic, recognizably different from the form of worship associated with the Byzantine emperors, which we now know as Greek Orthodox. But Orthodox just means correct, and Catholic is a word for universal. We might just as well call them Greek Catholic and Roman Orthodox. It was a case of each side, East and West, claiming to have the right form of Christianity. In the Christian Empire, where religion and politics were often almost inseparable, heresy became a form of treason. If the emperor was to hold his huge empire together as one, he had to be certain that everybody shared his interpretation of Christian doctrine. Well, even in fairly small modern countries with easy communications, we find it hard enough to agree among ourselves on matters of politics. So what chance was there in the vast Christian empire of everybody agreeing on that incomparable mystery at the heart of Christianity, the doctrine of the Trinity? The Gospels never mention the Trinity, but they do seem to talk of three gods, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, while insisting that Christians worship only one God. To solve that apparent contradiction, the idea of the Trinity developed. Three forms of God in one. So perhaps the three were in fact identical, and so could be seen as one. Three images of the same divine reality. And yet they were also known to be Father, Son, and Spirit. And that surely implied an old man, a younger man, and something different. But if God the Father is older than God the Son, is he senior to him in some way? Certainly not. They're equal. But an identical Father and Son made the Spirit begin to look the odd one out, however brilliantly the painter fitted him in. An artist of the 5th century went for an abstract solution. 3 concentric circles, with the doves now representing the 12 disciples. But that removed the essential humanity of the Christian God, of Christ, who is at the same time wholly human and wholly divine, another entire area of difficulty. With mysteries such as these at the heart of Christianity, it was hardly surprising that the emperors were confronted with violent disagreement. The area dominated by Rome developed its own idea of the Trinity. In Egypt, they claimed that Jesus was God, but never became fully human. In the Middle East, people were saying that Jesus the God and Jesus the man were 2 separate beings. So the Orthodox world, accepting the rule and the Christianity of the emperors, grew smaller. Here and here alone was Greek Orthodox Christianity. Nestling among the tower blocks of modern Athens is the tiny Greek Orthodox church of St. Theodore, echoing in miniature the roofline of its distant ancestor, Santa Sophia. In this service are all the details which became characteristic of Greek Orthodox Christianity. The love, even the veneration of the holy images. Icon is just the Greek word for a picture. Here, too, are all the tiny details over which the churches of Greece and Rome have quarreled bitterly through the centuries. Should the congregation be allowed the wine? Rome said no. In Greece, they are given it, and in good measure. It was not only disagreements over the niceties of theology which caused the Christian emperors trouble in different parts of their empire. There were also hostile armies seizing great chunks of it. Europe and North Africa fell to barbarians from the north. In the Middle East, there were the armies of Islam. And finally, much nearer home, the Turks. They encircled Constantine's city. In 1453, they captured it. Today, only Greece and Cyprus are still Orthodox out of Constantine's whole empire. And recently, even Cyprus has suffered further losses to the Turks. A camp for Greek Cypriot refugees and a makeshift church in a tent. The priest has a special role at a time like this, and this is the tradition in which President Makarios stands. When Constantinople fell, the last emperor died in the fighting. So the bishop, the second in command, became the natural leader of the dispossessed community. The original Christian empire had ceased to exist, but its traditions had long ago found an unexpected new home in distant Moscow. The domes of Moscow are improbable in one of Europe's most northern capitals. They derive from Constantinople, whose Orthodox Christianity Russia adopted in the 10th century. Here until 1917, the Christian empire survived. An all-powerful emperor, supported by his bishops, ruled from his castle, the Kremlin. What other castle has within its walls 3 cathedrals? The little town of Suzdal is like a museum of the Russian Orthodox Empire. Its churches are lavishly preserved by the Soviet Union, proud today of the craftsmen who built them, even if not of the emperor and his bishops who gave them their orders. But whether you praise the craftsmen or their patrons, the domes of Constantinople had acquired a distinctly Russian look. It does seem that it was the aesthetic appeal of Constantinople, more than anything else, which first drew the Russians towards Orthodox Christianity. The earliest Russian chronicle tells a story of how Prince Vladimir sent envoys to report on the different religions of the world. They saw Roman Catholicism in Germany. They were unimpressed. They decided that Judaism would not suit the Russian people. On Islam, the prince stopped them when they came to Muhammad's views on alcohol. The Russian people, he said, love to drink. That we cannot forego. But when the envoys who had seen a service in Santa Sofia in Constantinople brought their report, there was no doubt. We did not know, they said, whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is not such beauty nor such splendor. We are at a loss to describe it. And so Russia made Orthodox Christianity her own. And in Suzdal, or Moscow, or even the tiniest Russian village, that old Byzantine profusion of holy images added warmth and richness to Christian worship. So much so that the Greek word, icon, often seems today the name for a Russian painting. This had been the age-old image of Christian authority. Today, the last emperor has gone, but his patriarch survives like a living icon. The ancient rituals are still performed, no longer backed up by the realities of power. The Christian empire survives only in its images. The Christian empire gave rise to another very different tradition. Into the arid, empty Egyptian desert came men who rejected the gold and the glitter. They were the first Christian hermits, following the example of St. Anthony, who lived in the 4th century in this cave. Their way of life emphasized the difference between the Christian empire and the Christian gospels. Here in the desert, Anthony grappled with the devil as Jesus had, and his friend Athanasius described how Satan came at him in many strange forms.
He came one night with demons and lashed Antony so unmercifully that he lay speechless from pain. The wretched devil even dared to masquerade as a woman and would suggest filthy thoughts. But Antony would dissipate them by his prayers. It was as though demons were breaking through the walls of that little chamber and bursting through in the form of beasts and reptiles. Antony said, "It is a sign of your helplessness that you ape the forms of brutes."
You might think St. Anthony and his like were uncomfortable enough in their caves, even if they did acquire some holy furnishings. the beloved icons. But others soon outdid them in terms of discomfort. It was in Syria that hermits first decided to live on tops of pillars. They were the famous stylites. The first of them, St. Simeon, spent the last 20 years of his life on top of a column 50 foot high with nothing but a railing round the top to prevent him falling off. His fame was such that people came from miles around into the Syrian desert to hear him. Every afternoon, a crowd would form at the foot of his pillar, and people would shout up to him their problems, their worries, their fears, and the saint would yell back his advice. It was the first agony column, and soon the deserts were full of people living on top of pillars. Even asceticism goes in fashions. But the real contribution of monks in Christian history would come not from individual hermits, however dramatic their particular form of isolation, but from monks grouped together in monasteries. And it was here in Egypt, during the lifetime of St. Anthony, that the first Christian monasteries were founded. Below the rocky hillside on which St. Anthony had his cave, there has been for 15 centuries a monastery named after him. St. Antonys, a walled fortress against Satan. In the early centuries, anyone who had struggled through the desert to visit the monks could only get inside these high walls by being hauled up on a rope. Nowadays, things are slightly less complicated. In the village-like streets of the monastery, each house is the home of an individual monk. In it, he lives alone, prays alone, and normally eats alone. It is chiefly for the services in church that he joins his fellow monks. The first monasteries had been formed along exactly these lines, by groups of hermits who came together only on Sundays to join in worship and to share a meal. St. Anthony's still has something of that ancient pattern. It is a community of hermits. These desert fathers now live in a well-developed oasis. No caves, no unpleasant pillars. But within these walls are the eternal ingredients of Christian monasticism. Lives of self-denial devoted to God, with the pattern of each day defined by the regular call to worship. St. Anthony and his disciple, St. Paul of Thebes, are favorite images in this monastery, which grew up within sight of St. Anthony's rocky cave. His followers may not share his extreme views on diet. He was said to eat nothing but uncooked roots. But they have withdrawn as completely as he did from the political world beyond the desert. By the standards of the 20th century, life in this monastery is very simple. But to St. Anthony, it would have seemed the height of luxury. There is only one country in the world today which has been Christian almost from the start, and in which one can still find monks living with something of that same early simplicity: Ethiopia. An Ethiopian monk makes his way to one of the island monasteries on Lake Tana. Monks have been on the islands of this lake for many centuries. Their church is decorated with icons painted by generation after generation of their predecessors. Through their efforts, God has been given a glorious house.
አሁን በቀባው ነጭ ቀለም የፈረሱ ቀለም ነው። ያኛው ቅድም የቀባሁትኝ ቡላ ቀይ የልብሱ መጎናጸፊያ ጨርቁ ነው። ይሄ ነጩ ቀለም ነው። ያኛው ደግሞ
The good work continues in the way handed down through the centuries. But the life of the monks themselves has changed very little with the passing years. The monks of Lake Tana have chosen the remoteness of islands, just as St. Anthony retired to the inaccessible Egyptian desert. Lake Tana stretches 50 miles in the center of Ethiopia, a country which was ruled until 1974 by a Christian emperor. There are about a dozen separate islands here, each of which is a monastery, secure within its own shores. Darga Stephanos is one of the earliest and most important of the island monasteries. Poverty is a fact of life in Ethiopia, but it imposes on this monastic community an existence very similar to that chosen by St. Anthony and his followers. The monastic life is supposed to be simple. Here, it has to be.
ምን ይሻላል? ትንሽ
አዳር
ይዳር ይዳር
ጠላ የተጠጣ ጨዳ ዛሬ ሻይ
The head of the monastery is chosen by his fellow monks, and he keeps that position for the rest of his life. He rules the island with absolute authority. At the top of the hill, nearest to God, stands the church with its characteristic Ethiopian cross. The discipline of life here starts from an early age. Outside, a monk listens as boys read stories from the Bible or tales of Ethiopian saints. The books are all manuscripts, handwritten. Without the invention of printing, it's not possible for everyone to study the same book at the same time. So each boy reads aloud from a different text. Droning your way through these stories until they're known by heart is the basis of education here. The teacher has been through all this himself, and now, even though he's listening to many different texts at once, he claims to be able to pick up the slightest error. For the boys, this is the beginning of an entire lifetime spent on one island and with one purpose: devotion to God. The boys are the future of the monastery, but they are also its servants. Many of them are orphans or children of poor families sent here for their only chance of an education. They prepare food for older monks, who in their turn prepared food for older monks, and so back through the centuries to the very beginnings of the tradition which came here from Egypt. It was the young students and followers who kept St. Antony alive, high in his rocky cave, bringing him food up the steep hillside in return for words of wisdom or advice. The older boys, who are closer to becoming full monks, are guided in the ways of the monastery by the spiritual head of the island, the chief monk, one of whose titles is the teacher. In every monastery in the world, the day is punctuated by regular periods of worship or prayer. But here there are no clocks, no watches, only the sun. If the length of this monk's shadow is right, a moment for prayer has arrived. This is Meteora in central Greece, with rock formations irresistible to a desert hermit, outdoing the cliffs in which St. Anthony found his cave, or the pillars on which the stylites chose to stand. But this is in the very heart of the Greek Orthodox Empire, 16 rich centuries later, where each stylite once stood alone on his precarious pillar, entire monasteries now perch on top of pinnacles of rock. The earliest and the largest is the Great Meteoron. Monks originally chose this way of life to escape from the riches of the outside world. But Christian emperors and others have always given them rich treasures. The outside world has a way of intruding.
Deutsches Buch Meteora, color Buch Meteora. Français, livre, et le livre Meteora français, Deutsch, carte postale Meteora, souvenir Meteora.
Και έκτισε ένα μικρό εκκλησάκι και ένα μικρό κελάκι στο οποίο έμεινε. Εν τω μεταξύ, σε όλη του τη ζωή καθημερινώς άγγε τον τάφο του. Αυτό που θα τον θάβανε, δηλαδή όταν θα πέθαινε. Το θάβανε μέσα. Ιωάννης Ούρεσης Κομνηνός Παλαιολόγος και έγινε μοναχός με το όνομα Ιωάσαφ. Εν τω μεταξύ, όταν ανέβηκε εδώ, οι μοναχοί είχαν πληθυνθεί, είχαν φτάσει μέχρι τους 350 και αναγκάστηκαν να χτίσουν και το μέρος, τον κυρίως ναό και τον άρθηκαν.
At the end of the day, the outside world claims back the tourists. And at last, the monastery can claim its monks.
Αδελφέ, όταν αργήτης σχολάζει τις ερχομένης προς αυτόν λογισμής.
The traditional reading, to concentrate the mind once more on sacred thoughts, even if the hands are busy with tomorrow's souvenirs.
Εάν δε ο αντίδικός σου προλάβει, ζυζάνει αντίσή του, αληθής εν αυτό.
All the traditions of the Christian empire are here at Meteora. Among the jagged teeth of an unfriendly landscape, perfect for a life of self-denial, there can be found the rich imagery once used by the Christian emperors to glorify themselves, their state, and their church. When the evening bell tolls at Meteora, it tolls for more than the passing of a single day.